tips for securing free financial aid using the Small Business Administration's Paycheck Protection Program. So glad you're with us. My name is Doug DeLor, Vice President of Sales here at Givelify, and we're pleased to share important information about the government's COVID-19 second round of financing with you. At this time, when you see the news and despair, we all need our faith communities more than ever. Churches, houses of worship like yours are a place of comfort, refuge, and a beacon of hope, especially during these historic pandemic event we're having. So our job at Givelify is to help you keep the giving going so you can focus on caring for your community. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you for trusting us as your giving partner and making Givelify the highest rated, most adopted giving platform in the United States. We're proud and humbled to serve more than 40,000 churches, places of worship, and nonprofit organizations. For those of you who are guests watching and looking for an online and mobile giving platform, I encourage you to visit givelify.com to sign up today. As we get started for the webinar, please type in your questions. They will then appear on the right side of the screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. If we don't get to all of them, we'll have Tim and Matt, who's going to be our speaker guests, their email, and you'll be able to follow up directly with them. For now, I'd like to introduce our featured speakers. Tim is president and co-founder of Stimulus. It's an economic development firm for organizations, and his brother, Matt Conrad, is senior advisor at Stimulus. And together, they have over 20 years of expertise navigating the economic landscape for organizations just like yours. And they've helped dozens of organizations recently with the PPP program application process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim and to Matt. Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you, Doug, and good to be here. Good to be with you all remotely here. So this program, the PPP program, it's been out now for a little bit over a month. So I trust that we're talking to kind of a variety of attendees. You might have applied and already received funding. You might have applied and be in a queue for funding. And some of you might be still on the fence deciding whether to apply or not. So what we wanted to do today is go through fairly quickly, probably take 15 or 20 minutes on the front end to just give the 10,000-foot overview of the program. And then we want to spend a majority of our time dealing with questions. This is something that there's a lot of subjectivity on, a lot of uncertainty. So want to spend a bulk of our time addressing questions that you have. Stimulus, our firm, we assist entities connecting with government dollars at the local, state, and federal level. More often than not, that tends to lean towards the for-profit sector. This program is unique in that nonprofit participants can apply, places of worship can apply. With that, let's get started here. So at a high level, this program, it launched on April 3rd as part of the CARES Act. The program was cobbled together very quickly. This has led to a lot of confusion. And at a macro level, I certainly appreciate that we've gotten billions out the door, but at the micro level, there's been a lot of uncertainty, a lot of pain in the application process. So you are not alone if you've struggled through this program. Given that it's been out for a month, I'm sure a lot of you are kind of familiar with the basic framework, but for those of you who aren't, real quickly, it's probably best to understand this program in two components that work together. So the first component is a true loan amount. You can apply for 2.5 times your monthly payroll. Most banks are using 2019 as the basis for that. So you can include your gross payroll for employees, not contractors, healthcare contributions, and retirement plan contributions. Basically, divide that by 12 and then multiply by 2.5. And that is the loan amount. Now, the loan, from just a financing perspective, it's very favorable. 1% capped interest rates, no fees connected to that, no prepayment penalties. So the financing terms are rather advantageous. But this next bullet point is really what I think is drawing many participants into the program, the forgivability portion. So, so you will apply through a bank, and we'll get into a little bit of the details on that process, but you'll receive a loan amount if there is funding, and if you are approved. And then that starts an 8-week clock, during which you can bear expenses for payroll, including gross wages, retirement contributions, and group health care benefits. You can also include non-payroll costs. So we have here rents, mortgage interest, and utilities. And SBA guidance after the program, after the CARES Act was passed, suggests that only 25% of the forgivable portion, not the loan size, the forgiveness portion, can be in these non-payroll buckets of rent, mortgage interest, and utilities. As part of the application, there are, I believe, 8 certifications that have to be made. It's the application itself, it's a 2-page form, but there are lots of boxes that you have to initial. And this one right here is probably what's drawing a lot of questions at the moment. And I'll just read it here. The certification is that current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. Well, you know, that's something that probably 4 weeks ago, the focus was probably more on the word uncertainty. And really, it's a subjective standard, but in my mind, uncertainty 4 weeks ago was a pretty low bar. We were all living in a world of uncertainty. We still are to a large extent. You know, I would certainly assume that you're funded largely through giving, which as unemployment ticks up and the stock market goes down, is probably at risk. But this has really been something that's been in the news lately. Publicly traded firms applied for this. Shake Shack was kind of the poster child of this. The Los Angeles Lakers applied for this program. And there's been some bad PR, and SBA is basically coming out and saying, hey, we are going to test to make sure you meet this certification. And they've come out with some guidance that says that if your loan size is over $2 million, you're going to undergo an audit process in which we're going to test this. Now, how that's tested is to be determined, and we're still actually awaiting guidance. Many of you probably have questions about that. 2 days ago, SBA came out and said, you now have until May 14th, if you don't think this is a true certification, to basically get into the safe harbor, pay it back, and we won't ask any questions. So I would assume that some of your questions are going to be about this. Just know that we're living in still a world of uncertainty because SBA has not came out with that guidance yet as to how they're going to measure this. And we're hoping for some objective benchmarks, but really unsure at this moment. And then, you know, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but we're finding a majority of places of worship are finding that this is really the most beneficial program. And it's really that second component, the forgivable portion. This is more than just financing to tide you over until next year, deferring taxes, payroll taxes, things like that. This is truly potentially a dollar for dollar grant at the end of the day. So that's what's really drawing a lot of people into this program. You've seen in the news when this program launched in early April, everyone was trying to get in. We have clients that applied the day that this opened that are just now getting through. I'm sure some are still in a queue, especially with larger banks. So it's had a lot of interest because of that forgivable portion. So the application process, I would assume that many of you have applied already. For those of you who haven't, this is really conditional on funding being available. So we're now in round 2 of funding. From what I am hearing from bankers, there is still funding, but if this is something you're on the fence about, you're going to have to make a decision rather quickly. So when round one was coming out and exhausting all their funds, in the practitioner community, we had a pretty high degree of confidence that there was going to be a round two of funding. I would say I'm a little bit more pessimistic as to whether round three will happen. So if you're on the fence, you know, there are a lot of factors to consider, but you'll want to consider those fairly quickly. The application itself, fairly simple. It's basically a 2-page form that SBA has put out. You apply through your bank or credit union, and you do not apply directly to SBA. Like I said, it's contingent on the availability of funding. We haven't gotten an update in the last few days, so we're not sure what's out there. We do know that some of the bigger banks have very large queues that they could work through billions very quickly. What we are finding is that if you have a good relationship with your bank, that's probably the first door that you should knock on. Especially early on, most banks were saying, we will not accept you if you weren't a client. And some were even setting the bar higher that said, if you don't have existing debt with us, we won't take your application. What we're finding is that as more and more banks are getting through their queue, more banks are opening up to receiving new applications. But start with your new bank. If you have someone who attends your place of worship that's in the banking community, maybe talk with them. What we're finding is that personal relationships can be levered to take advantage of this program. One macro view has been bigger has not necessarily been better. What we found, especially in round one of funding, is smaller community banks just ran circles around some of these national big players that, you know, you would have thought would have had the processing power to get a lot of these applications out. They really stumbled out of the gate. So we will see. I think the bigger banks have played some catch up, but you would have thought that they would have gotten over those hurdles. We're now over a month that this program has been out and still seeing some difficulties. And then the documentation, like I said, you go through your bank for this. So a bank might require different documentation than a different bank down the street. But what we're finding really helpful is if you can submit your first version of the application with an attachment showing how you calculated your monthly payroll amount and 2.5 times that, your loan amount size, that's really helpful to banks. And then having something to tie back to from a tax document standpoint, we're finding most banks are wanting to see that Form 941. But reach out to your local bank. They might have differing requirements, and we'll be able to advise you as to exactly what you need to attach to that. So it has been frustrating to be a practitioner with this program. There is a lot of subjectivity. One of the better things that I think SBA has done is they put out some guidance for faith-based organizations. It's a 4.5-page document. If you've already applied for this program or are considering applying for this program, you know, take the 10 minutes to read through that. I think there are some really important points. You know, I think we live in a society that that likes to keep a barrier between government and religion. So there often is some skepticism with what's the catch on this. Am I going to have to sacrifice religious liberty in participating in this program? And there is some pretty strong wording that you don't have to sacrifice your religious character in order to participate in this program. But during the loan term, there is government involvement, and SBA does have non-discrimination obligations. And kind of a softball example that they throw out in this guidance is if you operate a food bank, you generally are not going to be able to discriminate against who can get the food, you know, on the basis of gender, age, race, protected classes. However, there's no problem if you want to limit the distribution of food to members of your congregation. So that's just something that I think you should certainly familiarize yourself with. And I'll get to this on the next slide, but I would imagine that your members and attendees might have questions about the religious liberty component. Being well versed in the SBA's guidance is going to help you as you walk your congregation through this. So just some considerations, and these are really more questions, things that you should be considering if you're already applied for this program or are considering applying for this program. Is this program the most beneficial program for me? And at a macro level, I can say for a majority of entities, this program is more beneficial than most of the other programs out there. And you are precluded from participating in some other programs to the extent that you take benefit of the PPP. But, you know, that's going to depend on your individual facts and circumstances. So one thing that's baked into the loan forgiveness component is a proration if you lay off staff. So if during that 8-week period that they're measuring expenses, if you're having large scale headcount reductions, that forgiveness component may be compromised and may be reduced by that. So that is one of many factors that you need to consider as should I do PPP or look at another program. And the uncertainty and necessity certification is another thing that really needs to be considered. You know, the SBA guidance that has come out so far probably has not been the most helpful to places of worship. You know, there's guidance that if you're funded by a hedge fund, you probably have to take a pretty good look at whether the funds are necessary. If you're publicly traded, are the funds necessary? And at this point, you know, the best guidance I can give in the absence of strong objective standards are kind of just with a straight face, can you say, are these funds necessary for me to keep payroll running, to keep the operations of my place of worship running? This is one that has to be viewed, prohibitions against taking on debt has to be viewed from a few different angles. One, you know, I've talked with some churches who suggested that they have bylaws in which their congregation actually has to vote on taking on debt. At least for that 8-week period, this is bona fide debt. So this is a loan that if certain conditions aren't met, you have to pay back. So how you do that in a COVID era of it's probably hard to attend at least an in-person congregational meeting. That's something that needs to be considered. And then, you know, to the extent that you have existing debt, loan covenants against taking on debt, that might be another reason why starting with your existing bank might be good, because they can keep it all under one roof and are already familiar with your loans that you might have. And then finally, one thing, this is just really an intangible, something that I'm seeing and talking with places of worship that have applied for this. How do you navigate member concerns over the program? So I don't have to tell you that you have a diverse group of attendees. You're going to have diverse opinions. Some people might have strong questions about that. I think what you can do to prepare is certainly understanding the religious liberty component. And then also taking a hard look at that necessity component. And if the funds truly are necessary, and if you are able to communicate that this is a short-term bridge that won't bring the federal government into your place of worship strongly, I think you're probably on better footing. So with that, like I said, wanted to go through very quickly, provide the 10,000-foot level, but we want to spend a majority of our time addressing the questions that you have. This program, I've referred to it as a dumpster fire more than once, so I'm sure there are lots of questions out there. So with that, Matt and I are more than happy to address the questions that you guys have.
Great. Tim, thank you so much. I've been capturing all the questions here, and more are still coming in. And for those of you who are watching the webinar and filling in the questions, I want to point out two things. Number one, we are recording this, so we'll be sending you a link of this recording so that you can go back and refer to it and play it to your church or nonprofit boards and finance teams for questions. The second thing we'll be doing is we'll also be sending you the slides from this webinar. So once again, you can share that with the folks in your organizations. And it will also have Matt and Tim's contact information so you can follow up with them. So Tim and Matt, I'm going to go, and I've been trying to group some of these questions together. And there was an interesting first one. The question is, my church is on the fence about applying for this. Although we're not physically worshiping, we still have parishioners giving through Givelify and sending contributions through the U.S. mail. We're meeting our obligations now. How would this benefit us in the long run? We can't predict the future. If we don't apply, then find ourselves needing it later. Are we up a creek?
Yeah, so good question. And this gets to that necessity. And we're supposed to get more guidance in the next 7 days. The SBA is supposed to supply more guidance specifically on what they're looking for here. My thought is this program was created to help companies pay payroll when, it's hard to do because of revenues dropping, in the for-profit revenues, donations in the nonprofit world, and because of all the uncertainty. And so, I guess short answer, in light of or without the further guidance, unless your church is one that sits on an endowment of many years worth of donations or payroll, I think it'd probably be best to get in line if you can now, because again, once the dollars are up, and I'll get to that in a second, they're up and we're not guaranteed a round 3 yet. And we certainly, working with different businesses and not for profits, have some that have 3 or 6 months cash on hand, and you could argue, well, they don't need the funds because they have money to make it through the next 8 weeks or the next 12 weeks. You talk to those entities and they say, well, yeah, but if we use that money now, in 3 months, we could be in a significant hardship and may not make it through. And so I don't think the test will be, can you otherwise make payroll for the next, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever. I think it's going to be more looking at the totality of circumstances. Does it put you in a bad situation if you were to incur other debt or to exhaust all or a substantial portion of your funds now to make those expenditures? And just piggybacking on that, I know there were some questions on how much money is available. We don't know the answer. I haven't seen anything, as of a few hours ago on that. They did release on Sunday, which was 1 week into the round 2, that of the $310 billion that Congress allocated for this, $175 billion was claimed, so more than half. That leaves about $135 billion for this week. So, I would anticipate it will be gone this week, but certainly no direct knowledge on that.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Matt. And there was a follow-up question very similar. It said, if our church's payroll's not been impacted, should we still apply for the PPP? And I think your answer is, look in the future, it's uncertain. If in doubt, you should probably go ahead and apply for this. Is that a correct assumption?
If I was the finance chair, that's probably the position I would take now. I like to leave all doors open. By not applying, you might be missing the timeline and put yourself in a situation where if you decided you should have applied, you can't. There is a provision where if you apply and even are granted the PPP loan, let's talk about process for a second. So an application is submitted. A bank eventually takes that application, submits it online through a portal only banks have to the SBA. The bank then, or the SBA rather, gives approval to the bank. And at that time, the bank has, and this is not hard and fast, but the guidance says they have 10 days to get the money to the borrower. And so at that time, you would get the money. Anywhere in that process, before you get the money, you could make a determination, hey, while we thought 2 weeks ago we might need this, now we know we don't. And so we're going to, bank, we don't want the money. In addition, at least currently through next Thursday, even entities that receive the money can give it back and say, hey, we thought we needed it, we don't. And no penalty, no problem with that. So, given that timeline, I think by sitting and waiting, you're pretty much virtually assuring that your only chance would be in a round 3, if there is a round 3.
Got it. Another question: are churches able to apply if their staff are all volunteers and not paid?
Yeah. So great question. And I'm going to lump in with that, another couple of categories that people typically ask about. The short answer to the question is no. The loan amount calculation, even though loan proceeds can be used for payroll, rent, interest on debt, and specifically mortgage interest for forgivability, and utilities, the loan amount calculation only takes into account payroll. It doesn't take into the amount of loan you get, only takes into account payroll and does not take into account those other categories. For purposes of payroll, there was a lot of confusion initially, and a lot of applications were submitted based on 1099 data, other things like that. The SBA has clarified that it's only wages, really W-2 type wages, although there is an exemption or an exception rather for pastors. Not all their wages are subject to W-2. But in essence, W-2 wages are the only thing that qualifies. So let's talk about what's excluded. 1099, so contractors who are paid under 1099 would be excluded. And then volunteers, unfortunately, there's no mechanism to count the value of their volunteer time towards this as well. It's really just the actual wages that are paid. Doug, was there a follow-up on the question by chance? We may have just lost Doug.
Yep. Sorry about that, guys.
No worries.
Sorry, I'm having some. Very good. Let me try that again. I asked and it cut off, so I apologize if you answered it. Do your employees have to be full-time? Was the question.
Yeah, good question. There's not a full-time requirement. All the wages can be included. There is a full-time, part-time, even student employees has been clarified. There is a test that compares your head count or your full-time equivalency, FTE number, to a prior period, and that can be a reduction in forgiveness. Probably more complicated than what we need to get into for this presentation. That calculation is based on FTE or full-time equivalency, which under other SBA programs means 30 days or 30 hours rather a week. So we're assuming that's going to use the same definition here, which means every employee who works 30 hours or more is deemed full-time, and part-time employees, if you had 2 employees working 15 hours a week together, they would be deemed 1 FTE or full-time equivalency. It looks like we may have lost Doug again. I wrote down some of the questions I saw going through here.
And one, I think people wanted us to repeat the documentation that we suggested. Like I said, please contact your bank, because what we're finding is that what Chase Bank is requiring is not the same thing that Fifth Third is requiring necessarily. So it does depend on the bank you use. But here at the bottom, I showed Form 941 seems to be the most authoritative payroll document that banks are asking for. And then certainly some sort of spreadsheet detailing how the loan size was calculated. I will tell you, we've worked with some banks that I believe the attachments to the application ran about 20 documents. So this is by no means an extensive list, but this will at least get you started in that process for documentation.
And I believe some of you are exempt from 941. You're just going to have to work with your bank, on what that is. It may just be your payroll records are sufficient, to provide that. Essentially, what the banks are tasked with by the federal government is just confirming that your payroll numbers are accurate. There was one criminal case that's been brought under PPP, announced 2 days ago, I believe, where a couple people completely fabricated employee records and things like that. And in that case, the government is going after them for criminal fraud. So banks just have to verify the data you have, and I think you can work with your bank on what they use to do that.
Great. Hey guys, I apologize to our viewers. My internet keeps coming in and out. So apologies on that. Thanks for continuing, Matt. I don't know if you addressed this, but the question is, what is the normal timeline between getting approved and receiving the funds?
Yeah, so on that, let's start with the whole timeline again. Actually, receiving approval and funds is supposed to be 10 days or less, although we've seen some that are a couple days and some that stretch a little bit beyond that, but not too much. The bigger question, just to add to that, is timeline between applying and receiving confirmation, and that's all over the board, from never. We have companies that applied and have never received any confirmation yet, to, again, it can be a couple days depending on who you bank with. So once you have an SBA approval number, you are locked in the system. That's the golden ticket, per se, that means you do have a reservation of funds under PPP. And at that point, it's merely the bank drafting some loan documents and working on a few issues like that to get the funds to you. But on the other side, I know, a lot of people are saying, I applied, when do I hear more?
Mm-hmm.
And the bank is the only mechanism to get that information to you.
Great. There's a couple questions on the banks, and I'm going to ask them both for you. The first one says, our bank, which is Chase, refuses to accept any more applications. What do we do? And then there's a second one, says, my church banks with Huntington Bank, based in Ohio. They closed applications just after 2 days the first time. They're still not receiving applications because they received too many. Are there any options? So similar questions, different banks. What do you do if they're not taking those applications?
Yeah, and we've worked through this program with Chase, Huntington, and a number of other banks. And what I do want to say is I think every bank is doing the best they can here. They are getting bombarded with anywhere from thousands to millions of these applications, depending on the bank and the size. And I don't want to badmouth the banks, because I have a lot of friends who are bankers, and just talking to them, I know they're working long hours, weekends, trying to get this figured out, get these processed. I don't think there's any ill intent on the part of the banks. That being said, we've worked with a number of entities who ran into hurdles like this, where their bank said they're not accepting more applications. Some of those have gone to other banks. And I will tell you that each bank has their own criteria from we also aren't accepting new applications to we're only accepting applications from current customers, meaning customers before the PPP came about, to we are processing new applications for entities, but we need to know that you're going to move your accounts to us. We need a verbal agreement that we will become your bank if we're going to do this for you. And then some that have said, we have the time, we just want to help, businesses. We're willing to process, on a first come, first serve, applicants that come. And I'd say that's all over the board. I know you serve customers all over the country. I will say, I think the bigger banks that are receiving millions or tens of millions of these applications, they're the ones that are trying to act, more in fairness and saying, okay, we'll accept some, then we'll shut it off and go on. I think if you're in that boat, you may want to try some of the smaller banks, some of the community banks. And I think, as Tim mentioned when he was going through the presentation, relationship is part of that. So before you knock on a door or go through a drive-through, because most of the branches are closed, looking your membership is one of your organization's members or finance committee members or board members or elders a banker, or know someone well, or a neighbor who is a banker. I think having a direct connection certainly helps in getting this done, and I would try to find that before I just go knock on a door and try to find somebody. Because the other thing I'd add is, if you go through a branch, especially not the main branch of a bank, they know about this program, but most of it's being processed at either bank headquarters or regional office or something like that. So going to the local branch that happens to be in your neighborhood, they may be able to help, but it's probably less likely than it would be if you can get to someone that's actually involved in the PPP program at that bank.
And one thing to piggyback off those thoughts is we're finding a lot of entities that are scared to get out of line. So they, applied within the first few weeks of this program. From big banks, they're just getting boilerplate emails of you're in the queue, but no indication of are you number 10 in the line or number 20,000 in line. And looking at the application, you do certify that you haven't received another PPP loan. You're not necessarily certifying that you haven't filed another PPP application. So we have dealt with entities that got frustrated waiting in line, were a little fearful to get out of line and out of the queue that they were in, went to a bank that they felt was a little bit more nimble in working with this, received the loan from the second bank, and then withdrew their application. So that's one thing the entities we've worked with have considered.
Okay. That's really good advice and good to know. Thank you. Another question. One person said that their church applied for a grant, and they just noticed yesterday that they did receive a very small amount from that in their checking account, but it was nowhere near what they applied for. And I think this goes back to criteria, and they were just curious, what's the criteria? Because it did not cover a month's salary.
Okay, so great question, and it's hard to get into the details of anything specific without knowing all the details. But my guess is, if money just hit the account, it likely wouldn't be PPP funds if there weren't any loan documents exchanged. So again, going back to process, there's an application that's submitted, but then just like every other loan, there's a promissory note that the bank needs that says you promise to pay this money back. Typically referencing the potential forgiveness features of the loan. And so if an entity applied for the money and then never heard anything back and never received any loan documents, that would be the first I've heard of that happening. My guess is that money could be tied to another program. I did see some questions comparing this to the EIDL, Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. That is a separate program, but also is administered by SBA. So it could be that some funds came through EIDL. When applicants applied for that, you put wire instructions in. A difference there is that money flows directly from SBA as opposed to flowing through a bank. But unless someone else in your organization did receive those loan documents and sign those, I would imagine those are not PPP funds that came in that way. Getting at the aspect of the question, the application amount and then the loan amount being different, that is possible. Oftentimes when we submit the application, we also submit the formulas that we use to calculate that loan amount. And we have had banks that go through and do a calculation of their own that for whatever reason, they say their calculation works out to a different number and they process it for that number. I think it's always been smaller. So that is possible. And unfortunately, because the guidance has been coming along all the time, banks have used different formulas to calculate this. Tim's basic formula is true, but when you get into the details of how do you calculate payroll or what numbers do you use, there's been some inconsistency there. So it is possible that you apply for a number and get usually a slightly different number, but it's usually not dramatically different.
Got it. There's a question later on here to dovetail, and it's that our bank manager is a believer and a friend of our school who indicated that faith-based organizations appear to not be getting the same consideration as other businesses. Have you heard of that happening?
Short answer to that one, no. I have not heard of that. Now, there were a number of complaints in round one in particular about the treatment of Wall Street type entities versus Main Street type entities. And, your big, publicly traded or just larger companies pulling down millions of dollars that got approved, whereas you had a number of what would typically be deemed Main Street entities applying for tens or hundreds of thousands who didn't. And so, again, not accusing banks of anything, but there were a lot of complaints about that. I have not heard of any banks discriminate on a basis of faith-based. I think if that's true and if there's evidence of it, there's certainly the standards that the federal government sets for private entities, with regard to non-discrimination, it holds itself to or deems to. I think that would be a class action lawsuit waiting to happen if there's any evidence of that happening.
Very good. And this is not a question from the team, but it begs, I'm sure that I noticed that in this second round, the average loan amount was approximately, I think, $73,000, which is dramatically lower than that first one. So I think that validates to what you're saying. So is it fair to say that it's much more scrutinized and applicable to the small businesses, or in this case to the smaller places of worships and organizations like that?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think if you look at, certainly if you look at the average number in round one, and I don't remember exactly what it was, compared to the average in round two, the average number in round one was bigger, which probably meant, and it makes sense. Most business entities take care of their top customers first, however they measure that, right? And so in a banking world, if they took care of the customers that pay them the most in fees and other things first, I guess it wouldn't surprise me. A lot of businesses do things like that. Mm-hmm. And so that certainly could have happened some, under this program. And it would make sense that once those larger accounts were taken care of, in round two, you'd see a lot of the smaller ones getting through.
Great. I'm going to focus on a couple questions here, and we may have answered some of these when I was having internet issues. Can a church apply if their employees are paid out of pocket, not via W-2 or 1099?
Assuming that means paid in cash, we give them a couple $100 and we don't withhold taxes, or the answer is no. There'd be no. Well, I say if all employees are paid that way, then no. So the loan calculation is going to be based on the documented earned income, reported, earned income, mm-hmm. and specifically historical. It relates back to, there's two different periods you can measure with this. One is last year, so 2019 numbers, and then the other is more of a rolling 12 months. So if you think this is May, you could use May of 2019 through April of 2020. And you can use either of those prior year periods to calculate a monthly average. But they're going to use wages that were reported to the federal government. And so, cash that wasn't reported, unfortunately, cannot work. The one caveat is that doesn't mean you can't apply. So if you have 10 employees who are W-2 employees who earn wages, and then you have 5 or 10 or 100 1099 or paid out of cash volunteers, whatever, you can still apply. It's just that only those 10 W-2 employees and the numbers relating to them will be used in your loan amount calculation.
Got it. There's a related question on this, Matt, and it's if there's no payroll and the ministry's part of a charter, can they apply? And if so, what documents would they need?
I'm not sure what is meant by charter, and if there's a follow-up question, we can get clarity on that.
Okay.
Let's talk about two issues there. If there's no payroll, that's reportable payroll from a prior period, then the answer is no. I've not found a way that those entities can apply. The charter brings up an issue that can't apply to faith-based or for-profit. There are affiliation rules, and so in the for-profit world, if you have a parent company that owns a bunch of subsidiaries, there's rules that make you aggregate your employee count, for those purposes, and potentially maybe do one application. In the faith-based, denomination or similar world, it's just something to look at. So, for instance, if maybe this is where the question was getting, if a church operates off of a charter of a larger organization and they're really legally part of the larger organization, then it would be the larger organization and the payroll at that larger organization that would be the applicant or the one that could apply here, not an individual division, if you think of it in the sense of a for-profit sense.
Okay, very good. Another question, is the PPP the same as the Economic Relief Disaster Plan, 10,000 of which is like the grant?
So no, that economic disaster referred to as the EIDL, Economic Injury Disaster Loan. Again, both are administered by the SBA, so there is a lot of confusion among a lot of people with those, but EIDL is administered directly by the SBA. The application process is all done directly with the SBA. And I didn't check today, but for a long time, that application process has been closed as they try to work through the backlog of the initial applicants, whereas PPP is an SBA ultimately approved program, but is handled 100% through banks and credit unions and similar organizations.
Okay, great. Another question, how much of the loan has to be paid back?
Okay, so it all depends on the uses, and let's talk about that. So the loan amount is calculated based on payroll only from the prior 12-month period, however that's calculated. And let's just say your payroll is $10,000 a month on average, which gives you a $25,000 loan, to make the number simple. The day you get that loan, and let's say the day was May 1st, that starts the clock on an 8-week period, and your expenditures during that 8-week period are what determine your forgiveness. Okay, so the maximum forgiveness is the loan amount. So the most you can be forgiven is the $25,000. Mm-hmm. If during the 8-week period you spend no money, you pay no payroll, pay no utilities, pay no rent, pay no mortgage interest, your forgiveness would be zero. Okay, so the money does have to be spent during the 8 weeks in order to achieve forgiveness. And then within that, there are some rules. So payroll, which includes any health insurance paid and any retirement benefits paid, is an allowable use. And the only real cap on the payroll side is on a per employee basis. They cannot receive more than $100,000 or the pro rata portion. We still need some guidance on exactly what that pro rata portion means, but I think that my best guess is $100,000 divided by 52 weeks times 8 weeks, which works out to $15,384. I think that's probably about a cap on a per employee basis. But that payroll is the biggest bucket that can be used for forgiveness. The other buckets then are rent, utilities, and mortgage interest. The agreements, the rental agreement or the loan had to be in place before February 15th, so you can't go sign up a new lease or something for that.
Mhm.
But those buckets in the aggregate, the non-payroll buckets, cannot be more than 25% of your forgiveness. So in our little example, if you have $25,000 of loan, if you spent $15,000 on your payroll side, then your maximum you could spend on rent and other things would be $5,000, or the number that would make up 25% of the whole, factoring in that $15,000.
Very good. You've answered probably another 3 questions in there, because I know there was one about explaining that portion with 100,000. So thank you. And you also mentioned retirement. There was one question that I think is along these lines, and it was, are health reimbursement payments eligible costs that can be included and forgivable in that?
So that's a great question. And on a lot of these, we need more clarity. There's a lot of ambiguity right now, and I expect that the SBA is going to provide clarity. And I bring up the statute just so I can be clear as to what is said right now. And what it says is included in this payroll cost number is payment required for the provisions of group healthcare benefits, including insurance premiums. So what it contemplates there, I think, is your typical health insurance, vision, dental, et cetera. If the program is more in line with, hey, for our church, if one of our employees goes to the doctor, we'll reimburse them, 50% or 100% of that cost. So you're kind of your own little self-insurance plan. It's not clear, what that ultimately is going to be yet. And just as the banks are kind of the gatekeeper individually for the loan amount and for validating the payroll in the way they best interpret under the rules, it appears that the banks are going to be the gatekeeper on the forgiveness side as well. And in the absence of specific guidance on any issue, I think it's going to be on a bank by bank basis, how they interpret the rules for how they ultimately take the submissions of every applicant for the forgiveness and get that approval from SBA. Hopefully, I expect we will get more guidance from SBA that does provide some more clarity. No matter how much guidance is given, there's always usually some gray areas or some questions, and I think that's going to have to be handled on a bank by bank basis.
Great. We have about 5 minutes left here, and going through some more questions. One of the questions that the application itself asked is, what is the start date of the business? And the question is, what if you don't have the exact start date? What do you do?
Yeah, so in the for-profit world, it's probably a little bit easier because typically you organize or incorporate, or in 501c3s, typically file articles of incorporation. But churches are exempt from that. Don't have many choose to, but you don't have to. And so if you did not do that, you would look for some other evidence of when you began operating. Because the loan amount is ultimately tied to payroll, when payroll started would probably be a good date for that. There is a provision in here, for new businesses that were not around last year, and they're allowed to use January and February numbers to calculate their average. So, if you had not paid payroll in January or February this year, I think you're out of luck, because under the formula for how you would calculate the payroll, you wouldn't have anything to show. If you never did start a business in terms of file articles of incorporation, but you do have documented payroll for January and February of this year, I think those payroll records could be used to show, hey, we were started. Hopefully you could also show that, we had church meetings during this time period, a bulletin or whatever. But the payroll would probably be the best evidence of that.
Very good. An interesting question, and this begs in this time of uncertainty. I think I know where this question's coming from, and this comes to fraud and how do we know if we're approved? The question is, the SBA sent an email saying that we were approved. And when we contacted the bank, they said it wasn't true, and they don't know why the SBA sent us that approval email. I don't know if you can answer that question, but it begs to really, what should you look for and how will you be notified so that you can avoid a lot of the fraud that's going on right now?
Absolutely. Okay, so it brings up 2 points. One, PPP notifications are all made by banks. The only one that gets the notification of loan approval is the bank. And so they are the only ones that are communicating that to the SBA. So which means an email coming from the SBA to any of us with regard to is not a PPP approval. I think it could be one of two things. The EIDL program that we talked about, which is often confused with PPP because it was all part of the same original legislation, that created it. Under EIDL, the SBA is notifying entities directly that applied. And so I think it does make sense to go back and look. Maybe we were approved for EIDL, but when we called the bank, they didn't know anything about it because that is a separate program not administered through the banks. The other point, I think, Doug, that you were alluding to is, unfortunately, the fraudsters know that this is going on. They know that there's a lot of desperation in the for-profit and non-for-profit world from a cash flow perspective, et cetera, and they're taking advantage of that. And we have clients who have received fake emails or fraudulent emails purporting to be from the SBA, requesting additional information about their company that, are typical kind of fraud. How do we get your bank account information, et cetera, et cetera. And it's hard to tell, not being a fraud expert, but I would say try to validate the real email address. Oftentimes they can somehow make it look like it came from the SBA when it really didn't. Even if it did, if there's a phone number there, call it, see if it matches up. A company we work with got one of these emails, actually did reply, but thankfully not with any sensitive information, and then called the phone number underneath, and it was clear it was a bogus phone number, not tied to the SBA. So I do think vigilance is important with regard to PPP. All notifications should come through your bank, so I would not trust any PPP notifications that do not come from your bank, at least at this time. There may be some follow-up eventually that would come from SBA, but not at this time. On the EIDL side, which is directly with SBA, I think you have to be very vigilant there as well, and just try to validate that information did come from the SBA and not from someone else.
That's really helpful. I'm going to ask one more question, and it has to do with the PPP versus EIDL. If a church is not eligible for the PPP program because the staff is all volunteers, is it eligible for the EIDL loan?
Yes. So in 2 minutes, we can't get through all the EIDL criteria, but the applications are completely separate, and the criteria are separate. EIDL is dealing with economic injury measured in other ways. Typically it's used for things like hurricane relief, and so it's dealing more with property damage. Here they specifically opened it up for entities that are having other kinds of economic hardship, but there is no direct requirement on the statutory side that there be employees. And to be honest, there's still a lot more mystery on the EIDL side exactly how that's going to be administered. On the PPP side, there's been lots of guidance. On the EIDL side, We know a lot of companies that applied. We've worked with a few companies that have applied for that. Of those, I'm only aware of one or two that has ultimately received any kind of approval or funds on the EIDL side. Whereas we work with dozens of companies that have received the approval on the other side, and so yes, you can apply. There are other criteria. They're much less clear, and I think the SBA has been so overwhelmed approving for the banks the PPP that they've been a lot slower on the EIDL side.
Great. I got to take this opportunity, and on behalf of all of the folks who've joined the webinar, Tim and Matt, want to thank you very much. This is extremely helpful. And I would encourage, if we haven't been able to get to questions, and I know there's still some out there, please feel free to email Matt or Tim. As a reminder, I'm going to be sending this slide presentation out to all the attendees. The other thing I'd like to encourage everybody is to join our Facebook group and blog. It's a great opportunity for you to share best practices of what you're doing as a church, what you're doing as a place of worship or a nonprofit in these tough times. And if you take a look here, it's our Facebook group. It's called Givelify Community for Faith Leaders. And we'll also be able to address some questions from the Givelify aspect. Finally, I want to thank everybody for joining. Once again, for Matt and Tim, and thank you for making us and trusting us as your giving platform and making us the highest, most highest rated and giving platform in the U.S. We look forward to helping you and want to make sure everybody stays very safe. God bless, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you all the attendees.